Thank you for this very warm welcome. As Penelope was saying, I'm Pierre Grandjouan. I'm the French consul in Houston for the states that you mentioned. And I've come here a few times already, not enough, and I'm hoping that I'll be coming to Little Rock and to Arkansas more regularly. I want to thank Dean Rathford for organizing this discussion today. I want to thank Penelope Sur also for helping organizing it. Since I've first came to Little Rock, since actually before I left for Houston, I've been wanting to come to the Clinton School of Government because I'd been told that it was an interesting place to create links with, and because I feel I have a link with the school. My first posting was in Washington at the beginning of the 1990s, at the beginning of the first mandate of President Clinton, and of course I was there in Washington a few years having left, after I'd left another school of government. So I feel at home here, here in the Clinton School of Government, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to say a few words to you. What I thought coming here was that as we're at the end of the French presidency, it'd be a good time, rather than talk about France, to talk about Europe. Where we are at the end of the presidency, and maybe where we are in more general terms. It's obviously been a very eventful period, and I think what we need to do is look at how Europe has navigated through the various crises we hadn't planned for during our 6 months of presidency. Explaining Europe to the outside world isn't very easy. You remember probably Henry Kissinger's dismissing remark when he said that he didn't know what telephone number to call when he wanted to talk to someone in Europe. I think if we want to be fair to that discussion, we have to recognize that it's also not very easy to talk about, to explain the European projects to Europeans. And sometimes when you listen to the discussions we have been having in Europe, there's a sense that all we have to show for the 50 years of European construction is a slightly cumbersome institution and no clear sense of direction. That's why I think it's a good moment to, because of this question mark we have on how Europe is working, and because we're going through a difficult phase in our history, it's interesting to look not just at what we've done during our presidency, which I'll try to do briefly, but also try to convey the sense that Europe is in fact relevant to today's issues, and that as a new administration arrives in Washington, I think we are well positioned to look forward to a renewed and stronger transatlantic partnership. One brief word about the presidency. I probably do not have to spend too much time in this respected School of Government to explain how the European presidency works, and we can come back to this point later on in the questions if you want. But you know that the member states, each 27 member states take turn in chairing the European Council for 6 months, which is a very short period of time, and to do something which is difficult. It's when you have the presidency, you're doing something which has both a very high political visibility. You're expected to push important issues and set priorities. And at the same time, what people want you to do is make the whole system work. You have the discussions in all the different bodies, the Council, the Commission, 27 member states which have to work together. And what the presidency has to do is try and work towards compromise and results on all the issues that are being discussed. And when you look at our work program, that's what you see. The objectives we set for our presidency cover all the important areas for Europe today, from defense issues to the review of the common agricultural policy, the Lisbon agenda, which focuses on improving the competitivity of European economies. But what we, at the same time, what we need to do is set priorities. And initially, what we had 4 priorities. We said we were going to work on defense, the reform of the CAP, which is because we had an important deadline during the year, climate change and immigration issues. And we've done that. I think we've particularly we can come back again on those specific points later on, but we've worked a lot on energy and climate change. Climate change is obviously something that cannot wait. You may remember that the EU had set very ambitious goals in March 2007, I think. We were going to increase we said then, and we are now going to increase energy efficiency by 20% by 2020, reduce greenhouse gases by 20% also, and increase our share of renewable energy by the same amount. And that's what we have to do. Once you've set the targets, you need everybody to agree on how in practice it's going to work. And that's the difficult work of the presidency that we've been working on. Hopefully we'll see more clearly in the next few weeks. There's a council meeting on the 15th of October. There's an important, 15th of December, there's an important meeting going on in Poznan at the same time on the international dimension of that discussion. And we'll see whether we've managed to do what we wanted to do. What we've said until now is that we had to stay the course. The economic situation is very difficult. It's probably not very realistic to think that you can make progress on energy and environment without any cost to the economy, but we're convinced that climate change and energy security, which is also a very important subject for Europe, which we've done some work on during the last few months, are things that have to be addressed even in a difficult economic climate. Immigration was another big long-term issue for Europe. You're aware, of course, that we've grown very fast from 15 to 27 member states, and that has changed the parameters on immigration. We felt that it was important to redefine what our common objectives should be, and we've worked on agreeing on what we've called the European Pact on immigration, which is a way of trying to get to a more harmonized immigration policy between the various member states. We have common principles for legal immigration. We're going to coordinate the fight against illegal immigration. We want to work together on reinforcing border controls, organize a discussion on member states' policies on refugees, and work together on something we call co-development, economic help for the countries where immigrants are coming from. And finally, we're going to work on something that we call a blue card directive, because it's probably a reference to the fact that another important country has a green card system. We thought we'd have instead a blue card directive to harmonize conditions for the entry of qualified workers. So that was our priorities at the outset. But as always, when you start that process, you can't really predict what's going to happen. So and there are obviously a number of things which weren't on the agenda initially that we had to deal with. The financial crisis is one. I'll say about Georgia. And before that, I just want to say a quick word about something which is very technical, very political. It's both at the same time very important for Europe to begin with, because that's how we're defined. It's the treaty. We have to have a clear vision of how Europe is managed. And it's something that we've grappled with for 7, 8, 10 years, because we knew that going from 15 to 27 member states, we had to change the way the institutions work, and it's been difficult. We had a first attempt which didn't work very well, and then we had a second one, very ambitious, drafting what we call the Constitution for Europe, which was rejected by a referendum in France and in Holland in 2006. And we had to start again. And what we did in 2007 is negotiate the Lisbon Treaty, which was adopted at the end of, in December 2007, and then had to be ratified. We felt, having done that, sorry, that we had more or less settled the issue. Everybody had agreed to a practical way of addressing the institutional discussion in Europe. But then we found that Ireland had a referendum and voted against it. So we had to address that question. And for a while, there was a real question about whether it was going to work. But we found that probably with some explaining and bits of discussion and convincing, we found that the ratification process is moving forward. The treaty has now been approved by 26 countries, the French Parliament, which was important since we'd rejected the previous version, the Constitution, the Dutch Parliament. Very recently, at the end of November, we had the two remaining countries, Sweden and the Czech Republic, which did the last steps they had to do to make it, to get to the ratification. We're left with the question of Ireland. It's a very important question and it mustn't be ignored. But overall, I think we're now fairly confident that by listening carefully to everybody's concerns, we'll find a way of moving forward by the end of the year. And that will give us something which is important for what I'm going to talk about next, which is our ability to decide. Having a European Union that can make difficult decisions in difficult periods. We'll have new voting rules they're fairly complex, and I won't go into the detail of the voting rules. But the important idea is that we're going to lock in a new balance of power between small and large member states, which, as you know, from your American discussion, is always a very sensitive issue and a very difficult balance to find. That should hopefully put us in a better situation for the future. But during our presidency, we couldn't wait for that discussion to finish, and we had to address the situations as they came. as they came. The first one, probably the one I want to say a few words on, is the situation in Georgia. The conflict between Russia and Georgia was obviously a very important issue for the European Union to address. And so we did our best. On the 1st of September, there was a special council meeting where we formally condemned the decision by Russia to unilaterally recognize the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. The President Sarkozy and President Barroso and Javier Solana went to Moscow and Tbilisi and reached an agreement on September 12th. And since then, we find that what's happened is that there's been a partial withdrawal of troops, partial. Observers have been deployed, and negotiations have started in Geneva. It's a discussion that is starting. It's not over, far from it. But what has been agreed until now confirms to us the impression that we've found more or less the right balance between being firm on the one hand and promoting dialogue on the other, condemning the invasion and the unilateral recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and helping find a settlement. Now, the other big crisis, and what we've been mostly focusing on in the last few months, obviously, has been the financial and the economic crisis. It's a very testing period for Europe because we haven't got institutions to deal with it as such. But we knew that, as in Washington, we had to find a response quickly and clearly. We had various options that were tested informally with the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, in the UK and Germany and Italy. The assumption being that if we came up with a plan, present and tried to discuss it between the 27 member states, it wouldn't work, or at least it wouldn't work quickly. And then we went to, we had an in-between step where the President, Nicolas Sarkozy, convened a meeting of the Eurogroup. The Eurogroup is the 15 countries which have the euros. You know that not all the European countries have adopted that new European currency. Normally, it's purely a finance minister meeting. It's never been convened in this heads of states format. But I think that's probably what helped us get to a plan that was agreed by the 15 countries of the Eurogroup on the 12th of October, where they agreed on a number of principles, and then it was taken by the full Council 3 days later. And so what we have is a set of principles which made it possible for the European countries to adopt their own financial packages adapted to their own situations, but along similar principles. And it meant that in those few days we were able to announce a very ambitious rescue package, 1,700 billion euros, which was at the time about $2,200 billion. It changes all the time now, so I'm not sure what the figure would be, but sort of something in that order of magnitude. Some of that money will take the form of interbank loan guarantees, and part of it will be in the form of public stake in banks, which need a new infusion of capital. There was a last step to get to, because as you decided that all the member states were allowed to spend all that public money, you had to change the rules on the budget discipline that we'd set for Europe. And that's, we had an objective of balancing the budget in 2010, and obviously this objective had to be cancelled. Beyond the emergency measures, we now have to work on the next steps. The first one is a stimulus package, which we are in the process of discussing at the moment, along a similar process where we're trying to establish principles that are the same for all the member states, and at the same time leave each country respond to the specific situation it's in. And beyond that, what we need to do is start the more long-term process of rethinking both the financial architecture of Europe and the global response to the crisis. And you see that there are, in fact, several different discussions that are running in parallel. There's one that's specific to Europe, and to the system of economic governance that we have. We're not saying, and nobody's saying, that we should question the independence of the European Central Bank, which is important for our monetary policy to work well. But what we do need is a stronger leadership at the EU level to give to the finance ministers, equivalent of your treasury, the ability to have the type of dialogue that your treasury has with the Federal Reserve. And then there are a number of steps that have to be taken that are global, that are not just European. We have to work on tax havens, closed tax havens, both outside and within Europe. We have to probably work on a stronger regulatory regime and control and transparency of financial institutions, not simply in Europe, but globally. And for that, the idea was that we were going to have start off this process with the last G20, with the G20 meeting, which met in Washington a few days ago, in November. And I think with what we've seen at that meeting, it's always a bit difficult to assess the result of a G20 or a G8 meeting, because you have a statement and it's not actually very clear whether you're actually moving in the right direction or not. But what we had, I think, was clearly enough at that stage the start of a process. We've agreed that we would start working on a new financial architecture, reinforce macroeconomic cooperation, and get on the path of restoring growth and define common principles for the reform of financial markets. So that's what we've done in the last few months. Immigration, climate change, the various international crises, the financial crisis. And if you will give me just 5 more minutes, what I want to do very briefly is reflect back on what assessment you can make of Europe today at the end of that period. I think we have to accept that there is a perception, sometimes justified and sometimes exaggerated, that, as I said in my introduction, Europe isn't always working very well. And the questions are very legitimate. We must recognize that when we had this debate in 2006 on the Constitution and the French people rejected the proposal that was put to them, I think we have to remember that all the main political parties, from the right and from the left, were strongly advocating the adoption of the constitution. And people didn't want it, and they didn't like it for reasons that had to do with Europe and hadn't. They said, well, Europe, it's fine, but it's not answering the concerns I have. And when you asked what people's concerns were, they'd say, well, mostly it's about jobs. We need Europe to be good for employment. And we clearly hadn't been able in that discussion to make the case that Europe was capable of doing that. And if we have phases where the opinion is rejecting Europe in such a big way, I think it's something we have to take on board. It's also interesting to note that the opposition to Europe itself isn't really a European-wide debate. You have a debate you have the debate I talked about in France, but the no vote in Holland was linked to something else, probably, that the preoccupation of small countries with what they perceive as the excessive influence of the larger member states on their own domestic choices. And probably the vote in Ireland is more related to this than to anything else. But once you've said that and you accept that at the same time we have moved forward, we have a new treaty, we have new institutions, we have a Europe that is working, I think it's also useful to just look back and see what we've done in the last maybe not 50 years, because we've done a lot, but in the last 20 years, we're completing a real single market, real in the sense that it goes far beyond the usual notion of free trade. We allow the free movement of goods, of capital, of people. It's a very sensitive issue, people, and if you look at your debate on NAFTA, you'll see that it's always a difficult subject. Technical issues like standards, we're harmonizing standards in the 27 member states to make it easier for companies to sell goods everywhere in Europe. We have, of course, a new single currency, a new European Central Bank. It's useful to remember that. They're all new. The euro is 10 years old. The European Central Bank was created at the same time. We've gone from 15 to 27 member states. It changes the EU itself. It also changes the political landscape of Europe. It's helped first with the profound transformation of Spain and Portugal or Greece or Ireland. We've locked in the return of Eastern and Central European countries to a unified Europe. And I hesitate to mention the unification in Germany because it's obviously not, it's a German issue, it's not a European issue, but it's also is an important change in Europe. We've managed to reform older common policies, develop new ones. We had the common agricultural policy, which was the subject of intense debate in Europe and at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We have not abandoned it, but we have transformed it in very significant ways. Today's European agricultural policy is very different from what it was in the 1980s. And we've made progress in other areas, less visible probably, but very important for the future, such as defense. We had a treaty at Saint-Malo a few years ago, which started a process. And the new issues I mentioned earlier, climate change, immigration, and I could mention also probably innovation policy, which has created a lot of work. And that's where we are. What matters most in the end is our ability to build. And I think the process of European integration in the last 2 decades demonstrates that we have that. and our ability to act. And the events of the last few months, I think, show that we have a number of significant achievements to show for our efforts. It's probably true that if you ask someone what it means today to be a European, you won't have a very clear answer. But I think what we've done in the last 20 years and in the last few months has moved us a little bit further in that direction. I'll say one last word to conclude on what it means for the transatlantic dimension. Clearly, from the list of subjects I've mentioned, it's very clear that we're facing the same issues: the financial crisis, Russia and Georgia, Iran and the Middle East, I haven't talked about, but they're clearly on everybody's mind, immigration, climate change. None of that can be dealt with solely in Europe or in Washington. I think that was the message of the G20 meeting in November. And what is clear to me today is that we have very similar problems and we also have very similar goals. I'll just take two examples. Energy, I think. We have a very convergent approach now, probably, than we've had for a number of years on climate change, on energy security, on the economic dimension of the debate, which is obvious, which has always been important, but is now more difficult to address. I know that the President-elect has very ambitious goals for all those subjects: energy security, reducing CO2 emissions, encouraging renewable energies and energy efficiency. There's a building, I understand, next to the school, which is a very good example of an energy-efficient building. The new administration, like us, will also have to address the economic consequences of the measures we're about to take. And we have countries in Europe that, like you have states in the US, which are mostly dependent on coal. And it's something we have to accept and we have to address. I talked about, and I won't go back to this subject, I talked about the economic crisis. I think when I make a list of the measures that have been taken in Europe, you recognize more or less in the same sequence the debate you've been having in Washington. You had urgent measures to stop the credit crunch. You've been talking about how to deal with banks. And then you talked about ways of stimulating the economy to prevent a recession. It's exactly the sequence we've had, and we're about to engage in the same wider discussion where we all recognize that we have to work together to define a new framework. At a time of doubt, we're facing clearly the worst economic crisis maybe in 100 years. The election of Barack Obama, I'm quoting what Nicolas Sarkozy said after he was elected. He said, it's an indication of the vitality of American democracy, a demonstration of openness and optimism. And I think that's where we are now. We have a Europe that it's maybe difficult to see from a distance, as it is difficult sometimes to see when you are in Europe, but it is working well and in the right direction. You have a new administration which will provide a very strong momentum. We were talking about it with Dean Rathford before the meeting. There's huge expectations in Europe, maybe too large. And out of necessity, or maybe as much as out of what are histories and a sense of the friendship between America and Europe means for all of us, I think it's a very opportune moment to give new dynamism, new strength to the transatlantic relation. Thank you very much. I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Mr. Consul General. One question here before I toss it to the crowd. You are here at the Clinton School one day after Senator Clinton was named Secretary of State. Can you comment on her appointment as Secretary of State and how that is and will be perceived in France and in Europe?
Well, I can only tell you what I feel. I haven't got any official reaction from Paris or Brussels. But as I told you, I was in Washington at the beginning of 1990s, and I know that Senator Clinton is an extremely respected statesperson in Europe, and her appointment will be seen as a very positive development, a sign of strength and purpose.
All right, yeah. Questions from the audience? Anybody have? We have a question right here.
I can only answer questions if they're not too difficult.
Yeah, keep your questions short, please.
You mentioned agricultural policy. In the last copy of The Economist, there was a comment that European Union agricultural policy has not been successful and that President Sarkozy is perpetuating something that may or may not continue to work. Would you comment on the success or lack of that policy and where you see that going? We're an agricultural state and you're one of our greatest competitors. We're interested in knowing.
It's a very interesting subject. It's not something it's not a question I've been asked very often in the last few months in Houston. People are less interested in agriculture in Houston. I'm not sure why. And it's as I said, it is a difficult debate. And it's a question that we could spend a good hour and a half discussing in its own right. We started the CAP to give more food security to Europe. The initial purpose of the CAP was you'd had the war, people had been hungry, and you needed a more modern, productive agriculture, and that's what we did. We did that, and we were very successful all across Europe. After that, we had to reform it. It was obvious that when you started having an agriculture policy which produced big surpluses, it didn't make sense. You may remember in the 1980s that you had these dreadful pictures of big mountains of tomatoes or whatever being burnt, and it was so we started reforming the CAP at that time, and we haven't stopped. So we are reforming the CAP. We've done very important changes at the beginning of the 1990s, again at the end of the 1990s, and in the last 4 years. And we have now a policy which is primarily directed to, I'd say, two things, or three things. Keep a strong agriculture, because I think we want to have a strong agriculture. Keep farmers in the countryside. We need our rural areas. We need the farmers in the rural areas. We need farms, and for the farms we need the farmers. And food security. And I think the changes, I know that The Economist has always been a very strong opponent of the CAP, and it's a difference we have particularly between France and the UK. But it's a difference that we'll have to live with. We need a strong CAP. We need it to not be detrimental to our international competitors, and I think we've gone a long way towards achieving that. But we need help. We need to keep our farms and our rural communities. That's the essence of our CAP today.
I have a question. Tesra, you've got one right back here.
I'm called Tezra Jamu. I'm a student of Clinton School of Public Service. In the past, there's been tension between your government and immigrants and refugees who are coming to your country. Now, in your speech, you stated that in order to reduce that tension, your government is going to embark on economic development with those countries where immigrants come from. What are you going to do exactly?
What we have in our European Pact on Immigration is a set of principles. And so we've said that one of those principles would be co-development, as you understand it, meaning more aid for the countries where the immigrant population is coming from. What it means in practice is something we then have to work on, and we have that principle in the European Pact, but we also have other areas of discussions which have an impact on that debate. We have another area which was also an important priority for France in Brussels, which was the strengthening of the relationship between Europe and all the countries around the Mediterranean. And we have now a new union which will help us address also that issue, not simply that, but also help this aspect of co-development. Co-development means more aid, but it also means and co-development is part of the relationship we have with countries where populations are immigrating into Europe. Another aspect which is also important is we're changing the rules a little bit to make it more difficult for illegal immigration and to make it easier and more to make it easier for people of those countries who want to immigrate to Europe and who have a degree or a business project to get into Europe and get a visa and a work permit. So we have a number of things to address the issue.
Question right here.
Thank you for your wonderful speech. Within Europe, how many nations are dependent upon Russia for natural gas and energy, and does that in any way compromise future political turmoil within Europe due to the Russian leverage on those countries?
Russia is obviously a very important provider of gas, supply of gas to Europe. And there are probably two separate questions. One is the general question between Russia and the EU, and the other is how do we deal with those countries which don't have a clear path, which are too cut off from the rest of Europe and too dependent on Russia. On the first question is the general relationship we have with Russia. Russia is there. It's important. It's big. It's got gas, but it's also a huge neighbor, and we have to have a productive, constructive dialogue with Russia, including on energy, and we're trying to do that. But it also means that I talked about energy security earlier. We have to address the energy security concerns that can result from the Baltic country or Poland being too dependent on Russia, for instance. And for that, that means that energy security in Europe has both an external dimension, we need to diversify supply, and an internal dimension. We need to connect all those areas that are not well connected to the rest of the various grids, gas, electricity, particularly Poland, the Baltic countries, those countries which are too dependent on one source of supply need to be brought in a more transparent European-wide energy system of connections.
We have time for one question, one more, right there in the back.
In the area of global climate change, what are the top initiatives that France is taking to reduce emissions aside from the nuclear?
We had I've talked about what we've done at the European level, and the European dimension is important because it's the cap and trade system for CO2, which will be a big part of working towards reduction in emission for all the European countries. What we're doing at the purely national level, you know that we're in a slightly unusual situation where if you compare energy consumption per person, there's a big difference between EU and the US. But if you compare energy consumption per unit of GDP, depending on how rich you are, the difference is much less. And you have countries like Eastern European countries, for instance, which consume less energy than the US, but if you control for the level of growth, it's about the same. France is in a different situation. We're about, if you look at the amount of energy or CO2 we produce per unit of GDP, we have half the amount you have in the US. The reason for that is the nuclear aspect you mentioned, which the nuclear program which we started in the 1980s, and we now have 80% of our electricity which comes from nuclear power, and if you add to that 16% of hydro and other renewable, we get to 96% of our electricity which is carbon-free, which you can go above that, but it gets difficult. But we've also worked on transport, and we have a good network of fast trains, and you know that a train journey is a tenth, produces a tenth of the amount of CO2 that a plane journey does. And so we have done quite a bit. And we want to do more. We want to do more because we realize that if you want to convince, particularly the large emitting countries like China and India and Brazil, that they have to take measures that can have an impact on their growth at a time when, now more than even before, but even before the discussion was very difficult. The balancing act between measures for climate and the economy. If you want to convince these people that you need to do more, you have to lead. You have to do more yourself. And so what we've done is we had a big session with the companies and the NGOs and the administration and the scientists, which we called the Grenelle de l'Environnement at the end of 2007. And we've adopted a new list of measures, and I I'd have to find the list for you, but it's easy to find. There are things like we're going to have a bit like what you have in your what you've been discussing in your energy bills in the last few months. Targets for buildings. We want to have most of our new buildings be energy positive by, I forget the date, 2020. So we have a list of new measures to increase energy efficiency, the use of renewable energy, the production, the research in the areas to go beyond where we are now.
Let's give a round of applause to the Consul General.